I'm here to talk to you about something that I don't suspect is going to leave you particularly uplifted in the sense that the situation is pretty serious right now. But I want to tell you the story of how this actually came about so that we have a better understanding of its value, the difficulties of getting it, and hopefully be able to have a better assessment as to whether it would be a good thing or a bad thing to be able to move outside of this nuclear deal. As was mentioned earlier on, this is the third book that I've written. It's essentially on a similar topic. It's on the geopolitics of the Middle East, particularly the relationship between the United States, Israel, and Iran. But unlike the previous books, which documented plenty of missed opportunities for diplomacy, this one actually was, in my view, a triumph of diplomacy. Whether we agree with a deal or think that it's going to survive or not, the mere fact that this deal could be achieved was quite astonishing in and of itself. But things have, of course, moved in a different direction ever since. But the fact that this issue was resolved, a conflict that actually was on the verge of a military confrontation, was resolved diplomatically without a single shot being fired, without a single angry tweet being sent out, is quite important, particularly when it comes to how we are going to be dealing with North Korea today, which is in many ways an even more imminent problem than Iran ever was in 2013 to 2015. During these negotiations, I found myself in a rather unique situation because I was advising the Obama administration, and at the same time, because of my previous books, I had access to the Iranian officials, including to the Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, who I interviewed on numerous occasions, as well as the US team, including Kerry and many of the others. And this gave me the opportunity to have this front seat privilege of seeing how the two sides calculated their fears, their hopes, what their strategy was. And I thought I would write about and tell this story so that the public would have a better appreciation of actually what did go into all of this, how difficult it was to get it, and what were the various variables and ingredients that are necessary in order to be able to have a diplomatic success in a case that otherwise was viewed as being extremely difficult. This deal, at the end of the day, it's important to understand, was not just about the nuclear issue. It is something that was truly about the geopolitics of the Middle East, and its consequences range from peace to war. And that's where I would like to start off, to give you the context for that. I want to take you back to April 2012. At a time when the United States is pursuing increasingly crippling sanctions against the Iranians are aggressively going forward with their nuclear program. The Israelis are making regular threats of potentially taking preemptive military action. In the midst of all of this, a most unusual group of people gathered in a very small country in Europe. You had 5 Iranian diplomats there, including 2 members of the Iranian nuclear negotiating team. You had several senior American officials there, including a very senior American general. But perhaps most surprisingly was the fact that there were 5 senior Israelis there, including one very, very senior person. At a time when the Iranians and the Israelis didn't even talk to each other, didn't even recognize each other's right to exist, having them in the same room was quite unusual. But even more unusual, what was actually being said. I'm going to give you a quote. "This is not about enrichment. This was never about enrichment." The Israeli official looked straight across the room into the eyes of the Iranians when he stated this. This was quite shocking. For 20 years, we had heard that Iran's nuclear program, particularly its enrichment of uranium, constituted an existential threat to Israel. Now, the Israelis told the Iranians themselves directly, this was not about enrichment. Instead, he went on to say that what Israel wanted to see from Iran was a sweeping attitude change. Essentially, the Israelis could not accept that the Iranians continued to question Israel's right to exist, and they absolutely could not accept that the United States would strike a deal with Iran, come to terms with Iran, without Iran coming to terms with Israel. If that were to happen, the Israelis explained, essentially Israel would be abandoned. The United States would resolve its core tensions with Iran, and it would move on because it has global responsibilities and plenty of conflicts around the world that it needs to shift its attention to. But Israel would continue to live in the region and face a hostile Iran, but now alone, without the full and automatic backing of the United States. The Israelis made it quite clear they could not accept this, and as a result, they would do everything they could to stand in the way of any agreement for this very precise reason. This was not just a moment of honesty, it was a moment of utmost clarity, because if you turn on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, these are not the explanations as to why there is a nuclear conflict. The driving forces of this is not, at least from the perspective of the Israelis, had never really been put out there in this fashion. To better understand where the Israelis were coming from on this, we need to go back another 20 years, 1991 to 1992. You had two major geopolitical shocks taking place in the world. On the one hand, the Soviet Union collapses, and the United States is the sole superpower of the world. In the region, Iraq is defeated by the United States and the UN coalition, which dramatically shifts the balance of power in the region. In these circumstances, strong states and weaker states find themselves in a position in which they have to redefine their roles. For the Iranians and the Israelis, who actually had enjoyed a secret security collaboration throughout the 1960s, 70s, including the 1980s, despite the Islamic Republic and its very venomous rhetoric against Israel, they did so because they shared common security threats, primarily the Soviet Union and strong Arab nationalist states such as Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Now those two threats were gone, and instead Israel and Iran emerged as two of the more powerful states in the region. Now, instead of seeing each other as potential partners, they see each other as rivals for defining the new order and the new balance of power in the region. The Israelis moved first, and rather cleverly, and they managed to convince the United States that in order for Israel to take a risk for peacemaking with the Palestinians, Iran needs to now be seen as the new threat, it needs to be isolated, and it needs to be sanctioned. For the Iranians, this was a disaster. They had hoped that they would come out of their isolation as a result of helping the US behind the scenes against Iraq. But what happened was that the United States adopted a policy called dual containment. Dual containment meant essentially that the new order in the region would be based on Iran and Iraq's joint isolation and containment. And the new order would be centered around Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt, the core US allies in the region. This was a disaster for the Iranians, who had hoped to come out of their isolation. Instead, the United States doubled down on Iran's isolation. And the Iranians did everything they could to undermine this order, including, and perhaps most importantly, targeting what they believed was the weakest link in the strategy, which was the peace process. If the Israeli-Palestinian peace process collapsed, all of the other strategic objectives of the United States and Israel in the region, they believed, would not come to fruition. So they supported Hamas, Islamic Jihad, etc., in order to undermine that process. But despite everything they did, it was not the Iranians that caused the collapse of the dual containment order. It was actually the United States itself, by George W. Bush going into Iraq in 2003. The invasion of Iraq, by definition, put an end to a containment policy of Iraq, and instead now we were seeking regime change. The hope, of course, was that the United States would be able to replace hostile regimes with friendly regimes. But it was essentially a miserable failure. Instead of creating a new order, all it managed to do was to destroy the old order, without now the United States having the power to enforce on the region a new equilibrium. And ever since, we have essentially seen the Middle East be orderless. There is no hegemon in the region strong enough to be able to establish an order. There is no combination of states that have that capacity. And this is part of the reason why we're seeing so much instability in the Middle East. Because essentially, we are in that transition period between one equilibrium to the next. We don't know exactly where in that journey we are, but we know that we haven't reached a new equilibrium. For the Israelis and the Saudis, the invasion of Iraq and its aftermath was a disaster. they had enjoyed maximum maneuverability in the region during dual containment. The United States was essentially guaranteeing their security while at the same time checking their rivals. For Iran, this was a blessing in disguise. Of course, the Bush administration had no love lost for Iran, but precisely because Iraq was a failure, precisely because the United States took out the Taliban in Afghanistan, took out Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Iran was now unleashed. And it had the power to be able to expand its influence in the region, and the United States no longer had the power to be able to, as effectively as before, contain and isolate the country. But it was still faced with a very significant challenge, and that was that it could not lock in this new beneficial geopolitical circumstance without the United States negotiating with Iran and recognizing that Iran is a major power in the region. It needed that diplomacy and that recognition. And it's precisely for that reason the Israelis and the Saudis opposed diplomacy, knowing very well that any deal, regardless of its detail, would signal an American acceptance of Iran as a power in the region that you have to engage diplomatically with. Ironically, however, the Iranians and the Israelis used the same instrument to achieve their opposite objectives: the Iranian nuclear program. For the Israelis, this menacing program, defined as an existential threat, combined with completely unrealistic demands of essentially saying that no deal is acceptable unless Iran is completely deprived of any enrichment capacity and technology, the zero enrichment objective. If you take an unachievable solution and you combine it with saying that this is an existential threat, you ensure that there is no solution, and in essence you ensure that eventually at some point the United States will be forced to take military action against Iran. And the balance of power and the equilibrium that would follow that American war with Iran, the Israelis calculated, clearly would be in Israel's favor. The Iranians had the opposite calculation. Yes, going forward with a nuclear program could risk war. The Bush administration certainly showed enough hostility from their perspective. But precisely because of the Iraq war, precisely because of the war fatigue in the United States and the American public pushing against more military adventures in the Middle East, the calculation was that if the Iranians push forward, they may also force the United States to come to the negotiating table, change its position on enrichment, and essentially accept the fact that whether you like it or not, Iran is a major player in the region. Here was the crux of the dilemma for the United States: how to avoid Iran getting a nuclear weapon, how to avoid war, how to avoid the Israelis starting a war that the United States thought would be disastrous, and at the same time, if diplomacy was pursued, how to avoid having the Iranians be in a position in which they would be able to define the new balance of power in the region after a negotiation. The Bush administration's strategy essentially was to not pursue diplomacy and to insist on zero enrichment and only go for sanctions, cyber warfare, and sabotage. The track record of that policy is quite clear. In 2003, the Iranians had roughly 150 or so centrifuges. These are the machines that spin and you use to enrich uranium to higher levels. By the time Bush left office, Iran had 8,000 centrifuges. Iran had zero stockpile of low enriched uranium. That's the material that you would have to enrich further in order to be able to build the bomb. By the time Bush left office, Iran had 1,500 kilos of LEU, enough to build one bomb. It was quite clear that a different strategy was needed. When Obama came in, it wasn't just diplomacy with Iran, but he wanted to reinstitute diplomacy at the core of American statecraft. It was diplomacy with Venezuela, with Cuba, and other countries. But within a year, Obama realized that talking about diplomacy with Iran as a state senator from Illinois is quite different from actually engaging in diplomacy with Tehran. Within a year, the limited attempts at diplomacy had failed, mainly because of problems on the Iranian side. And Obama found himself quickly in a position in which he was essentially left with the same instruments as Bush had: sanctions, economic sabotage, cyber warfare, and other forms of pressure. with one big difference. Precisely because Obama had tried diplomacy, which Bush had not, precisely because he enjoyed a different degree of international legitimacy, he managed to assemble the strongest sanctions coalition and the strongest sanctions we probably have seen any country face thus far. The United States even managed to sanction Iran's central bank, effectively cutting them off the international financial system. The week that happened, the Iranian currency dropped 30%. Over the course of 3 years, Iran's GDP contracted roughly 25%. The Obama administration even managed to convince the Europeans to completely cut off all oil purchases from Iran. Iran exported 40% of its oil to Europe. It went down to zero. The Iranians had clearly underestimated Obama. They never thought that he would be able to impose such crippling sanctions on them. But Obama had also underestimated the Iranians. Clearly, they were hurting, but they were not breaking. Nor were they without a response. If the American strategy with the sanction was to change Iran's cost-benefit analysis, essentially make it as costly as possible for the Iranians to continue to have a nuclear program, and reach a point in which the Iranians essentially would have to choose between having a nuclear program and having an economy, the Iranian response was essentially a mirror image of this. They were going to change America's cost-benefit analysis of pursuing sanctions. So they doubled down on their nuclear program. The more sanctions hit them, the more they expanded their centrifuges. And they did this deliberately to signal the United States the sanction strategy will only get you a bigger and stronger nuclear program, in the hope of convincing the US that the cost-benefit analysis of the sanctions policy is going to go in the wrong direction. So you had these three clocks ticking. The Iranian nuclear clock, in which they were trying to present the United States with a nuclear fait accompli. The sanctions clock that was trying to cripple the Iranian economy and force them to capitulate. And the Israeli wildcard clock of them potentially taking military action, which would dramatically change the situation. As these clocks were ticking, the president was convinced by a senator who ended up becoming his Secretary of State that a secret channel was needed to be established with the Iranians, because this official P5+1 diplomacy wasn't going anywhere. The Iranians would not give any compromises in that context. And to truly be able to see what could be achieved, you had to do it through backdoor secret talks. And he did convince the president that the country to use for such a channel would be the country of Oman in the Arabian Peninsula. The Omanis had already proven their capacity to maneuver the Iranian political context, because you may remember that there were 3 American hikers that were imprisoned by the Iranians. It's pretty sad. They hiked once, and they're forever known to be hikers, but they're actually pretty accomplished journalists, English professors who were living in the region. They were taken by the Iranians wrongfully and imprisoned for, I believe, roughly 2 years. The Omanis stepped in, they negotiated the deal, took them quite some time, but they eventually managed to win their release. And they did so not only to release these 3 innocent Americans, but also to show the United States that Oman has the capacity of maneuvering the Iranian political system, and that they should be useful to resolve the nuclear issue, because they were terrified that would lead to a military confrontation. The president was convinced, and the first meeting was held in July 2012. 2 mid-level officials from the American side, in addition to 1 other staffer, went, an equal amount from the Iranian side. And from the American perspective, the meeting had essentially only 2 purposes. A, to confirm that this channel was authoritative and had the blessing of Iran's supreme leader. It was no value talking to people who actually didn't have authority to negotiate. And secondly, to see how close are the Iranians to capitulating on the issue of enrichment. The Iranians came for a completely different reason. They came to see how close is the United States to capitulate on the issue of enrichment. And they were bombarding the American side with various formulations of how the US could accept enrichment on Iranian soil. As you can imagine, it was a complete disaster. After 1 day, they left. Both sides were quite disappointed. The channel almost died. And of course, you had the elections in the US in November of that year. But by January 2013, a completely different sense of urgency dawned on the White House. Exactly a year earlier, January 2012, then Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta had publicly stated that Iran's breakout capability is 12 months. Breakout capability means the time it would take for them to make a political decision to build a bomb to them having the material ready for a bomb. 12 months. By January 2013, the US intelligence services estimated that Iran's breakout capability had shrunk to 8 to 12 weeks. Clearly, the nuclear clock was ticking faster than the sanctions clock. And the president realized that if they just stuck to that same strategy, just going forward with the sanctions, hoping that it would force the Iranians to capitulate, the United States would soon face only two options. Either accept Iran as a de facto nuclear power or go to war. The outcome of an Iranian capitulation was increasingly unlikely because the sanctions clock was not ticking as fast as the nuclear clock. And there was nothing that could be done about that because there was hardly anything left to sanction. As a result, the two sides meet again in March 2013. But this time around, two things are quite different. First, the US sent a full delegation with senior officials, including the number 2 person at the US State Department, Ambassador Bill Burns at the time. And most importantly, for the very first time in the 20 or so years of this conflict, the Americans were armed with an instrument they had not even been allowed to talk about before. And that was a very carefully crafted statement on how the United States, under what circumstances, it would be willing to accept enrichment on Iranian soil. This was the absolute red line the Iranians had insisted on. They would not give or take anything unless this was accepted. And the US side, at least the Obama administration, knew that they were going to have to give something on this issue, but the plan was to do so at the end of a negotiation, not at the very outset of the negotiation. But because of the fact that the sanctions clock was not ticking as fast as the conventional talking points were saying, they had to play it at the beginning. Yet, despite this breakthrough on substance, there wasn't a breakthrough. Because after 35 or so years of American and Iranian distrust of each other and mutual demonization, the Iranians couldn't go back to Tehran and just say, hey, the Americans promised to accept it. They needed to have it in writing. The Americans could not put this in writing because if it leaked, or if the Iranians pocketed the concession, this would be a complete disaster. Keep in mind, the Europeans and the others had no idea that in the meantime, the Americans were actually negotiating in secret, and they were suffering through these really, really painful negotiations at the P5+1 level. So the idea came then, okay, if we have this trust gap, we're actually moving closer together on substance, but on the trust issue, we have a problem. Who is out there that has the capacity to bridge this trust gap? Who has the capacity to both know and have a respectful and trustworthy relationship with the President of the United States and with the Supreme Leader of Iran? And essentially only one person came to mind, and that's the Sultan of Oman. And the idea emerged that if the United States cannot put this in writing and send it to the Iranians, perhaps the US could write a letter to the Sultan of Oman, spell out the American position. The Sultan would then travel to Iran in between his chemotherapy, meet face to face with the Supreme Leader of Iran, not show him the letter, but convey to him its contents. And if the Iranians then rejected, it was calculated, it would not be a rejection based on their mistrust of the United States. They would be expressing mistrust of the Sultan. And the belief was that they would not be able to do this, and that's exactly what happened. Because of the Sultan's intervention, this issue was resolved, and the trust gap was bridged. And incidentally, all of this is taking place while Ahmadinejad is still president. He was against this process. This was before Rouhani came in. Now, I wanted to mention this for two reasons. First, to be able to show that when it comes to tricky diplomatic situations like this, the United States needs friends to be able to bridge trust gaps and be able to find creative political and diplomatic solutions. Particularly when it comes to North Korea right now, I think it's critical to be able to have that component. It necessitates making sure that we safeguard our alliances. The second thing is because of all of the talk we hear today, not entirely false of course, about Sunni-Shia tensions, about Arab-Persian tensions, we should also keep in mind it was an Arab state that brought the United States and Iran closer, at least on this issue. Now, after this, the official negotiations kick into high gear, take another 15 or so months, and by July 2015, a final deal is struck that in its simplest form achieves two objectives. It closes off all of Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon with a combination of restrictions and inspections, and it also essentially prevents a military confrontation between the United States and Iran. Two final points on this. Actually, let me limit it to one point, and then we'll take a Q&A. A lot of folks have argued that there was a better deal. If the United States just had pursued sanctions longer, it could pressure the Iranians more, it could have gotten a better deal. And the Obama administration's answer is that no, this was the best deal that we could have had. I actually think there was a better deal. In many ways, a much better deal from the American perspective. But it was not a better deal that existed in 2015 or 2013. It's a better deal that existed long, long before that. In 2003, the Iranians sent a proposal to the Bush administration. They had 150 centrifuges at the time, offering full-scale negotiations, including opening up the nuclear program for full transparency. The proposal was sent to the US partly through the Swiss ambassador to Tehran, who had been tasked by the United States to be a go-between between the US and Iran. I was working in Congress at the time. We got a briefing on it and was asked that my boss would send it to the president because it wasn't clear that if it just went to the State Department, it would reach the president. This was done. Kolarov got it. He even called back and asked a few questions about it. That's the last thing we heard of it until a couple of months later, an article in Financial Times said that some sort of a negotiation offer was made to the Bush administration by the Iranians through the Swiss, and the Bush administration's response was to reprimand the Swiss ambassador for having delivered the proposal in the first place. An opportunity to negotiate at a time when 150 centrifuges existed in Iran and zero stockpile was lost. It was neglected. 2005, right before Ahmadinejad became president, another proposal was sent. This time around, the Iranians offered to cap their program at 3,000. The Europeans didn't even send the proposal because they knew that Bush would reject anything that was above zero. In one of the meetings we had at the White House, we were trying to figure out, where do you think you're going to end up on this centrifuge issue? And someone asked, do you think it's going to be like the 2005 proposal that the Iranians sent? And the US diplomat negotiator laughed and said, oh, we would jump on that proposal if that existed today. But that ship has sailed. A couple of weeks later, I'm in Lausanne, I'm interviewing Zarif, I'm trying to get the same thing out of him to see, where do you think this is going to end? And I raised the 2005 proposal, which he incidentally wrote at the time. And I said, do you think you're going to keep 3,000, you're going to keep more or less, what's going to happen? And he chuckled and laughed. He said, 3,000? Oh, that was just an opening bid. We were going to settle for 1,000. But there were no negotiations that took place. By 2013, when the deal was struck, or the interim deal was struck, Iran had 22,000 centrifuges. And with the result of the deal, the Iranians went back to 5,000 centrifuges. 2,000 more than their opening bid in 2005, after a decade of sanctions. This is not to say that sanctions don't play a role, but when you combine sanctions, and you combine it in such a way that you essentially have a completely pressure-centric strategy, combined with very unrealistic expectations and objectives, you essentially give the other side time. Because over the course of those 10 years, the Iranians grew their program. They had 10,000 kilos of LEU in 2013. And perhaps most importantly, beyond their nuclear infrastructure, the amount of know-how that they had gained over the 10 years of sanctions was such that they could rebuild the program rather quickly, even if there was a military strike. This is not something that they did possess in 2005. And I think that should stand like a pretty good warning to ourselves and cautioning ourselves to make sure that when we are faced with situations like North Korea, etc., we have to be very careful not to allow the desire to look tough domestically to drive the negotiating strategy. Because in many cases, and certainly in the Iranian case, it actually led to a situation in which the United States had to settle for a deal that is far less attractive than what it could have gotten a decade earlier if it just had a more realistic position on enrichment at that time. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.